tonight on Projectsploitation.
The shining razor hovered above Sweeney's throat. It descended under his chin and scraped gently upward, taking away lather and stubble, leaving a clean, smooth swath. It rose again. "Take this ripper business," said the barber. He wiped the razor on a piece of tissue and poised it again. "It's got the whole damn town jittery. It got me pinched last night." Sweeney grunted interrogatively. "Carrying a razor. I keep my good home. I got a swatty. At home because somebody'd walk off with it around this joint. So every once in a while I take a razor home. Never thought nothing of it. Put it in the breast pocket of my suit coat, and the top of it shows, and damn if a harness bull didn't stop me right on the street and get tough. I was lucky to be able to show identification I was a barber, or he'd have run me in. Pretty near did anyway. Said for all anybody knew, the Ripper's a barber too. But he ain't." The razor scraped. "How do you know?" Sweeney asked. "Throats. A barber that went nuts would cut throats with it. All day long, people lay stretched out in front of him with their throats bare, and their chins thrown back, and he just can't help thinking how easy it'd be. And how, you know what I mean." Sweeney said, "You got something there. You don't feel like cutting one today, I hope." "Nope, not today," the barber grinned. "But once in a while, well, your mind does screwy things." "So does yours," Sweeney said. The razor scraped. The barber put a steaming towel over Sweeney's face and patted it down. He said, "Anyway, I figure the Ripper uses a knife instead of a razor. You could use a razor like that, sure, but I figure it'd be too awkward to hold for a long, hard slash across the guts like he uses. You'd have to tape the handle down to get a good grip on it, and then it'd be awkward to carry taped open. And it'd be a dead giveaway if anybody saw it. I figure he'd use a pocket knife. One small enough he could carry it legally, a pre-war imported one with real steel in it, so he could have one of the blades holding down to a razor's edge. Haircut?" "No," said Sweeney. "What do you figure he uses? A knife or a razor?" "Yes," said Sweeney, getting up out of his chair. "What do I owe you?"
Nightmare.
No, I mean it. I'd love to have someone to love or someone to love me. It ain't easy being a freak.
And we're supposed to do this by treating ourselves to a fancy womanizer, by turning them loose, hunting them down, and murdering them in cold blood.
What you are about to see now is the second degree of torture.
We should just bare our breasts to the wind and let nature take its course, right?
Hey, cops!
We don't have a permit.
Run! Sure it's violent, but that's the way we love it! Violent, violent, violent!
Will you listen to me, you freak preacher son of a bitch?
A bit strong for your taste, perhaps?
A bit crude for my taste.
Yeah, well, one day you'll find out that crudity is in the eye of the beholder.
Oh, it's hot in here. Let's take your clothes off. Be more comfortable, huh?
Oh, I think it's a pretty cheesy way to get a look at my fiance's tits.
You did a crime. The only person who could ever mischief this down would be the sucker with the bread to buy it.
It has a philosophy, and that is what makes it dangerous. Don't take it so seriously, it's only a film.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Projectsploitation, otherwise known as the Projects Pod. I don't know, I'm trying that one out because I've been getting a lot of complaints about the title of our podcast by multiple people, not just a single person. And to all those haters, I just want to say that we will never change. but I don't know. Maybe we can coin a little shorthand here. So, yes, welcome to Project Exploitation, the Projects Pod. My name is Nick Cheney. I am your host, of course, and with me is my co-host, Dan Jeremy Brooks. Dan, how are you?
And blood is all around, like the bird with the crystal plumage. His beak is like a knife, like the bird with the crystal plumage. The killer is the wife. Do 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 do.
Wow, we have instrumentals added to this recurring, I don't want to say gag, I will say bit. Would that be?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sounds right.
Yes. You know, one of these days I'm just not going to ask you how you're doing. So, the joke will be on you.
I know. I'll be so sad because I'll have had something prepared and I'll be like,
I know.
Damn it, this was my best one yet. Why?
That's right. So what was that a take on?
Oh, Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon Garfunkel. So.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I heard, I was like, bird with the crystal plumage, what kind of syllables is that? And I'm like, oh, like a bridge over troubled water. Oh, yeah. So, and it just seemed so epic that I had to go with it.
It's a killer final line, I'll give you that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, accurate, too.
It is. It is. It really is. So here we are tonight. We're going to be talking about our very first giallo film, and then we'll get into the murky waters of what that means. But essentially, it's an Italian slasher movie, if you want to crudely describe it. Of course, the movie we're talking about is The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Did I already say that?
Possibly. It's okay.
I cannot remember. Okay. We're already off to a rip-roaring start tonight. You gotta forgive me, people, okay? I got my second vaccine, and they gave me the wrong vaccine, so I have two vaccines flowing through my body right now, and all I've got is this stupid t-shirt and second and third tail to show for it, so... Oh, boy.
Now, it is possible that Nick has become superhuman with the mixing of the two serums, because...
Sure.
Literally, they don't actually know what'll happen. But so I'm trying to look on the bright side. Like, it could be that this will be like when Bruce Banner was supposed to gamma rays or something like that. And
yeah. Or even the super serum for Mr. Steve Rogers.
That's even better, actually. Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll be recording and, of course, tracking that progress on each and every episode from here until the end of this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But for now, let's talk about The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, directed by Mr. Dario Argento, his very first film, which is honestly kind of hard to tell when you watch it because it's just so damn good.
Oh, yeah. It's a remarkable debut. I mean, it's dazzling.
Oh, yeah. The movie did come out in 1970 and made quite a splash, at least over time, internationally, and really kick-started the career of Mr. Argento and pretty much the movement of giallo filmmaking. Not that it was the first, but it was probably the first with real cultural cash. And we'll get into all that pretty soon, but it's notable that this was, of course, based on a prior written work. And Dan, why don't you tell us about that?
Sure. It's by Fredric Brown, who was both a mystery writer and a sci-fi writer, and he's one of those rare individuals who is as distinguished in one genre as the other. Anyway, so he wrote this book back in 1949. It was a novel called The Screaming Mimi, and it's a good read. Angry, sexual, no, I'm kidding. That's from 3 O'Clock High. Never mind that. But a couple quick interesting things about Fredric Brown. He worked as a skip tracer before he started writing full-time. So that's kind of cool. So I imagine him doing kind of the midnight run thing, which is kind of intriguing.
Yeah.
I love that. And I guess he's considered one of the originators and one of the greatest practitioners of what they call short stories, what we would now kind of refer to as flash fiction, where it'd only be like a couple lines and he would create this entire story out of that. He's very famous for that. That might be his most famous contribution, it seems. And also he seemed to kind of predict the rise of that whole tail wagging the dog phenomenon we see all the time now, where the writers are sort of hobbled by, what we call fan service, like see, for instance, Star Wars 9, The Rise of Skywalker, etc. And there was a quote from Brown the year he wrote this novel, and he said he was seeing an increasing trend in science fiction. He says to his friend Phil, he's like, they are taking over. The fans are taking over. They will occupy everything in 20 years. There won't even be any room for writers like us. So I thought that was kind of funny because in some ways with the rise of the internet, that has sort of happened. And I think the other thing with the Screaming Mimi novel is that you can really see Brown back in 49 kind of partially helping, whether he meant to or not, to lay the foundations for the wave of like serial killer stories that we have now. So like I was thinking about, there's a declaration made by Jack the Ripper near the end of the film From Hell, and from Alan Moore's novel, graphic novel as well. But he says something like, well, one day men will look back and say that I gave birth to the 20th century. And I was like, man, that is certainly got to be the case in a lot of ways, because you consider how serial killer narratives like dominate the cultural landscape now. And I mean, the killer in the Screaming Mimi is even called the Ripper, even though it's set in Chicago. So I can see how someone like Argento, who was doing pioneering work in giallo, would take some inspiration from this, although it's very much his own film too. I mean, he takes some basic beats and some basic broad ideas, but it's very much his own story. So yeah, it was a good novel. I really enjoyed it.
Right on. And of course, Argento was not the first to adapt it into a movie. There was an American adaptation of The Screaming Mimi. Do you remember who starred in that one?
Yeah, it was Anita Ekberg.
Yeah.
And right. I think of her mainly as, like, she was in a couple pretty great Fellini films. Like, she was in La Dolce Vita a few years later, and I want to say Fellini's 8.5.
Yeah.
So I think of her mainly from those. But I mean, yeah, she's not very well remembered now, but she was something of an ingenue in Hollywood, even though I believe she was Swedish. I'll have to look that up.
Yeah.
But I haven't watched the film version, but that first film version is apparently very faithful to the original, while The Bird with the Crystal Plumage is more of it uses the novel as its jumping off point, and like kind of a couple of its mise-en-scènes are based in part on it. But like I said, it becomes its own thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, looking forward for a moment, Argento made the movie Opera from the 80s.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, that has a opera house. It has a killer who is lurking in the shadows, and it's very, very clearly inspired by the Phantom of the Opera, and also has no interest in the Phantom of the Opera. So I think that's a common occurrence when it comes to Argento and his ability to kind of reappropriate these materials and whatnot. And actually, that's a good segue, because that's essentially what giallo is. So the best way to explain giallo films for those who don't know, and probably to anger those who do know, considering there's all sorts of differing opinions. First, let's just take the etymology of the word. And giallo itself in Italian is Italian for yellow, the color. And these films were called giallo or yellow because of the fact that they were based on these crime and murder mystery thriller pulp paperbacks, and all of them had yellow covers.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, so it's literally an aesthetic moniker, the theme of what you call this whole entire genre and movement. So that's where the word comes from. Where people obviously start to get contentious is the same thing, we have in America with the film noir debate, i.e. what is film noir? Is it a list of aesthetics? Is it a genre? Is it both? Is it neither?
Sure.
And obviously everyone kind of has their own idea. So here's my idea of what giallo is, which is that it is a collection of films that were a part of a movement in Italy from the 60s to 70s, in which some, but not all, of the following are usually included. I guess the one thing that always is there's a murderer, okay? And usually an unknown murder. So that's the big thing, is murder mystery is pretty much the plot template.
Okay, sure.
The rest is kind of a grab bag of a lot of tools that were used throughout, but maybe doesn't crop up in every giallo you see. But the killer concealing his or her identity with clothing like black gloves and trench coats and all that, because they usually appear in scenes when you can't actually see who they are until, of course, the third act reveal.
Sure.
Obviously, beautiful women being butchered is a big thing. There's usually some sort of sexual impotence being struggled with, as we'll probably talk about in this movie. It doesn't always mean that the plots are psychosexual, but typically there's a form of sexual violence that exists outside of an actual sexual act, because it doesn't always have to be, for example, like rape, but it's usually some kind of misogyny or something like that that's being tapped into as to, why these crimes are happening.
Sure.
And obviously there's usually a quote-unquote detective in the middle of all of this who's really just a put-upon average Joe. He's not actually usually a detective. He just wants to solve it for himself or herself, usually himself. And usually the cops are kind of jerks, and obviously they are in the beginning of this movie, but this one skirts that a little bit because they're actually pretty collaborative with the protagonist in this one. But usually it's them throughout the whole movie saying, stay away, this is our case, that kind of thing and whatnot. So that's probably giallo in the nutshell, is the whole murder mystery aspect with a unknown killer, and usually the twist is, when it's revealed who it is. And a lot of these have, twist upon twist, so they'll reveal at the beginning of the third act that it's this person, when in reality that person only committed these murders, and actually the real killer comes along, kills that one, and it's revealed that that killer committed the other murders in the movie, that kind of... So there is a lot of labyrinthine convolution to some of these plots. The Bird with the Crystal Plumage being one of my favorites because it's actually pretty simple, and we'll get into that. But that's a pretty common... It's kind of like film noir. You watch half time I watch a Chandler film noir adaptation, I'm like, what the fuck just happened? I don't really know, Maybe I'm dumb.
No. Well, there's that famous thing. I mean, I'm sure you've heard it, but Chandler talks about the big sleep, and he did say, I don't know if he was just being hyperbolic, but he said that even he wasn't sure what all happened at the end. Like the plot got so complex that he couldn't remember and explain it very well.
Yeah.
So when they did the film, he was like, don't worry about it. Just do the film. Don't worry about being super faithful, because I'm not 100% sure it even works.
Yeah. And that, much like film noir with that kind of black and white gothic atmosphere, not gothic in the setting, but just the draping of the lights and whatnot. And giallo is very similar in that a lot of people, myself included, watch these mostly for the aesthetics. And it's not to say that we don't like the plot, because every once in a while there's a great one, but it's almost like getting caught up in the plot really goes against what makes these movies so magical and such a thrill ride, basically, is taking these mise-en-scenes at their face value in the moment, in media res, as they're happening. And I think when approached from that, because a lot of these productions are going to have bad dubbing, a lot of them are going to have international casts where nobody's, on the same script because, they're all working from different translations and whatnot. So these things, it's really a good ground zero for starting to get into exploitation filmmaking, because it forces you to kind of accept it at its own game because of the filmmaking practices that were so wildly different, mostly due to budget constraints and international modes of filmmaking at this level of cheap filmmaking, but also delivering some gorgeous imagery and very cheap thrills. So let's get into The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Do you mind if I go first, Dan?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Right on. So I love this movie. I think it's pretty much a masterpiece in my book, at least a masterpiece of the giallo genre. I mean, this is definitely one of the first ones I saw. It would have been one of the first most people saw if they were alive, during its release. While it's not the first one, like I had mentioned earlier, that credit usually always goes to Mario Bava, but sometimes gets split between whether it's The Girl Who Knew Too Much or Blood and Black Lace. And for my money, it's Blood and Black Lace, because his jump from black and white to color, I think, kind of is what made these movies catch on more, because no one really puts black and white giallos on their top 10 best stuff, even though they exist and they are good.
Sure.
It's just not, there's something missing when that's at the forefront.
Well, yeah, that would be kind of tough. I mean, I realize they're calling themselves yellow because of the yellowed covers and the yellowed pages, but still, I mean, you do kind of want a certain amount of color in a giallo, you know?
Absolutely. And, even some of the signifiers like black gloves. Well, what do black gloves mean in black and white? Some of these things are quite literally aesthetically driven. So for me, that's why I definitely would consider Blood and Black Lace, which is a great movie, to be the first true giallo. And but The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, fantastic movie. One of the greatest sound mixing of any giallo, because some of the giallos have horrible dubs. And it doesn't really bother me because I've watched so many of them now, so I'm pretty used to it. But rewatching The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, I kind of forgot just how well this dub works. I mean, obviously, the main actor who's speaking English I think his voice is dubbed by himself. Yeah. But I will say that even though it's his voice, and some people think that makes it easier, not always. I mean, it is hard to dub. That's why so many bad dubs exist. Like, if you want to actually get that one-to-one feeling of the sound you're hearing and the visuals that you're looking at, it's just not easy. And I think the cast overall in this movie is fantastic. Even like Susie Kendall, who doesn't have a lot to do in this movie, I feel like she comes alive in her scenes as a very put-upon girlfriend who's not really a victim in any true sense other than her one moment of distress. And even then, she technically escapes and saves the protagonist. And
True.
I think that's the other reason why I really enjoy this plot, besides the fact that it's got a simplicity to it of who the killer is and how that's revealed. But before that, I love this protagonist. This protagonist has this really weird, I don't know, almost dunce-like quality to him. He's not the brightest, protagonist, and it almost makes it frustrating to watch because of the fact that when you watch these kind of movies, you're usually watching a person who wants to piece it all together. And so when you're following that kind of mode of detective work, and yet the person who's doing it is really just not that bright, it can be frustrating at times. But this guy, the actor, Tony Musante.
Tony Musante, yes.
Yes, who I just found to be extremely charming. I think that's the big thing, is that no matter what situation he was in, I was on his side, and I very much wanted him to figure it out. And that's the other thing, is that, before I pass it off to you, is that the plot here is, while I said earlier, simplistic in the convolution of the plot twist, it is a pretty deep well that you can dig into when it comes to its thematic material, especially that of how it ties in with art and what art can contribute to, how it can tie into violence. And it almost is so weird because Dario Argento maybe not single-handedly, but certainly prominently kicks off the giallo movement in full force with this movie, and yet even in doing that, he already has made a movie that perfectly encapsulates why the giallo movement is so fascinating and you can't look away, and how it can have a profound effect on you, even if some people look at it and don't get triggered, for lack of a better word,
Right.
Because that's what happens, obviously, to our killer.
Yes.
So I'll leave it at that for right now. We got a lot to talk about. But Dan, what were your overall impressions of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage?
Oh, well, I mean, we were talking, it's an incredibly assured debut. I mean, it's shocking, like to the point where I'm like, well, I wonder if he spent a lot of time as a cinematographer or as an editor, or I mean, I should probably have done the research, to be honest, but it was just so interesting to see how well he understood how to craft a movie, where to put the camera. I mean, and of course he's working with just an incredible crew.
And he didn't even want to make it, by the way.
Oh, really?
Really quick.
No, go ahead. What's that?
He liked The Screaming Mimi, and he wanted, a movie to get made. And I believe he brought it to his father, Salvatore Argento. That is his father, when you see that name in the credits, and tried to get him to go find a director, because that's who he worked with other Italian directors. Or maybe it was either he tried to give it to Salvatore, or maybe it was Bertolucci, because he worked with Bertolucci too. Dario did, because he actually almost contributed to Once Upon a Time in the West, to the script.
Oh, really?
Yes, it was him and another Italian writer, and essentially none of Argento's stuff got used, but he was tapped, at least in the beginning stages, to write for it.
That's kind of cool.
So I can't remember, but Argento basically took the bird with the crystal plumage. I don't know if it was a story treatment or whatever, but and was like, this should be made. And then I think it was Salvatore, his father, was like, yeah, I mean, you can make it if you want to, And then he was like, all right. Like, he didn't really want to, but then, of course, the rest is history.
Huh. No, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Well, it's funny you were talking about the put-upon detective type in a lot of these giallos. And the Sam character, in the novel, he's called Sweeney, and he is also not a policeman. He's actually a reporter for a Chicago newspaper. And he's just like basically coming off this wicked 2-week bender. He's basically like what, I don't know if they still call it, what they used to call a jackpot drinker, where it would be somebody who could go a long period of time, like maybe months or even a couple years, where they would be sober and everything. And then they would get to a point where they would just either hole up in their room or just go on a spree, and they would blow a ton of money. And sometimes they'll call that jackpot drinking. And he definitely seems like a classic example of that. And the other thing is, his interest is a lot like Sam. Well, it's a little different because Sweeney in the novel, his interest in the Ripper case is also selfish, in the sense that he sees the would-be fourth victim behind glass in that scene that obviously inspired the Argento's gallery scene at the beginning. And he's instantly smitten with this girl. And he figures if he solves the crime, he'll get the girl, if you will. But as he proceeds, his conscience and his natural empathy and emotional intelligence keep surfacing. So you can see some parallels there with Sam, the writer, in this. In a way, I sort of saw Sam Dalmas. He kind of reminds me of those novelists from like the 30s through the 50s, guys like, F. Scott Fitzgerald or Steinbeck or Faulkner, who were lured out west to write for Hollywood and who consequently seem to like loathe themselves for their decision while simultaneously viewing themselves as really above it all. And he seems to have that, especially at the beginning where he's at the Ornithological Institute, right? Where he's like, I don't need the book. I got the check, So he has this almost like irritating self-confidence, even though, like you said, he's not necessarily the sharpest dude, but he's super self-confident. Like there's that part where he's like, well, it's not according to me she came down the stairs. She did. Because the inspector's like, so according, Morrissey's like, according to you, and he's like, no, not according to me. It's just, that's what happened. And he doesn't even seem particularly worried about Monica's continued health. Maybe I'm wrong, but so much as he's intrigued by the whole thing as a problem to solve, like the puzzle being the frustrating aspect to the gallery struggle near the start, where he can't seem to get his arms around what's wrong with the scene.
I was going to say really quick, for me, a lot of the movie, I think psychologically, come down to the fact that I feel like he has felt so unsatisfied being abroad because of why he had to come out there in the first place, that for this to kind of fall into his lap, he's got this ticking clock of before he's going to return back to the States. And if he can do this in his head, then at least there was some kind of meaning, even though it's really kind of utterly meaningless because it's very random and by chance that it even happened. But
right.
It's just kind of that, I don't know, ascribing meaning when there really is none. And of course, that's what he's dealing with. And the other thing I was really quickly going to say is that, you had brought up the reason why he was there in the first place with the book that he had to write, which shows just how egotistical he can be and also how not the sharpest tool in the shed. The first scene shows that he was commissioned to write a book about legendary birds, and not even he can figure out that that is a bird noise, which essentially would have solved the case for him to be in the right direction. So I like how idiotic it is because he's got his blinders on about the work he's doing, which he devalues, when in actuality it would have helped the very thing that he thinks is going to be meaningful.
Yeah, that's true. And if it wasn't for his friendship with Carlo, who's the ornithologist guy who puts him in touch with the society, I mean, he would have never made it to the zoo, of course, and there would never have been the climax in the denouement, if you will. But like you said, he's a very charismatic actor and character. But it is weird. It's like you can't tell if he's just not understanding the gravity of it, because he really sloughs off, first of all, witnessing a near murder, And then the attempt on his life, like afterwards, and he sloughs it off so much that when he comes home to Julia, she doesn't even take him seriously at first, I don't think. She thinks he's just selling her a bunch of jokes like, you know, ah, ha, ha. It's interesting. I just thought that was intriguing.
Even him witnessing the murder, I think there's actually a good psychological reason that he doesn't take it very seriously, because I think if you take, you know, the ending to at face value, which is that he realized that it was her attacking him and not the other way around.
Right.
That means subconsciously he may not have actually felt very threatened,
right,
you know, by this situation. He may not know why that's the case, but if he witnessed it, and he did, and he had those preconceptions that were mixed up, the fact that he's not very troubled by it was maybe a clue, because a lot of these movies are about the fragile masculinity of Italian male culture. Not to say that there's none of that here, obviously, but this is specifically, I would say, Eurocentric in the way that it depicts masculinity.
Sure. No, that's true. I mean, he does seem detached. And one thing I did think that was interesting, I don't know how you feel, because you touched on this earlier about the fact that him and Inspector Morosini do actually collaborate pretty well. It's not a very antagonistic relationship. I mean, after a certain point, you know, in some ways the film, I think, is almost like a rare reversal of roles for a mystery, where you have this untrained, accidental amateur detective, like you're saying, who seems to be much less emotionally involved than the police inspector, who one would assume, as he's a professional and he does this every day, like he would remain more detached and guarded, but he's not. He's very dedicated. Now, he's not quite as emotional as like somebody like a Kurt Wallander, you know, like the Swedish detective who's like, you know, just raw emotions all the time when he's dealing with these cases. But Morosini shows a lot more passion sometimes than Sam. That said, I do like the rapport that develops between them. And I love especially that shot at the very end where they're on the talk show and they show his exhaustion and he's like falling asleep while they're talking. And you're like, man, this guy has been working like hell on this. It's just such a nice little touch to see that. Oh, and also I think Morosini has my favorite line in the movie, which is, he says, right, bring out the perverts, which I personally think, you know, that would work for all sorts of wonderful occasions to be quoted.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, like, next track you make, Dan, you can just sample that bad boy right there.
I should. Honestly, I watched it with Heidi a few days ago, and she responded and laughed the same way I did. And she's like, whoa, what a great line. I'm like, I know. It's such a classic line.
It's pretty great.
It is. You know, I think you mentioned the idea that Sam doesn't feel very overly threatened or troubled. And I think a lot of that has to do with what I see as like maybe one of the main two or three themes kind of in the movie. And this is probably true of a lot of giallo, which is this idea of this combination of voyeurism and containment, I guess. You know, at the beginning, it's very neatly pictorializes both those ideas in a very compact way. I mean, it's interesting how the basic act of watching characters on screen going about their day can go from feeling like neutral and even prosaic to terribly foreboding with the simple addition of short freeze frames and the occasional sound effect of the camera clicking. You know, it denotes a voyeur's view, someone's probably unwelcome gaze at the very least, which suddenly kind of makes us voyeurs too. And the freeze frame traps the person we're watching within that, in theater, they would call it a proscenium arch, which is like the borders of the stage. You know, four sides are surrounding her because she's suddenly frozen in this freeze frame. And then once you realize it's a POV shot, I immediately start thinking, well, it puts my mind to just a brace of cinematic antecedents. I mean, there's William Powell's Peeping Tom,
yeah.
Right, which, I mean, not one of my favorite movies, although maybe I'd like it more now. I like The Archers a lot, but the beginning of Halloween, of course. I was thinking about Fade to Black, which is a lesser-known film, but I mean, it was very much about the influence of movies on a killer's actual style of killing. And Cruising, obviously, you got Adam Egoyan's Felicia's Journey, and of course Black Christmas has a lot of wonderful POV shots that are incredibly groundbreaking, which we talked about before.
Yeah, a lot of the Friday the 13th movies, you know, have Jason's POV, if not like his literal POV, like just an overarching, when he's in the room, it's from his POV at the very least, emotionally. Right.
We were talking about, obviously this being Argento's first movie, but I mean, he has some really legendary talented collaborators in this. And by the way, I realized he did this the same year as Storaro did Bertolucci's The Conformist, which I think is one of the most visually ravishing films ever made. I mean, that's just me. But the cinematography at the beginning, where you're seeing the girl with the short hair and the plaid skirt, and, you know, before you realize it's freeze frames, you know, that she's being watched. Yeah, it's so lush. The photography is so lush, and Ennio Morricone's score is so soothing, and that the intrusions of the camera clicking sounds and the freeze frames feel particularly like invasive. It's like you're going along this very like paradisical, sun-dappled scene, and then the clicks and freezes draw you out of it over and over. It's like you're in a dream that, I don't know if you've ever had that thing where you've set your alarm to go off every 5 minutes. And so you keep going back into this dream, and then the alarm goes off and you're like, what is this sound? You know, and that was how the clicks were. It was like, we go from this very paradisical scene to ominous, super ominous all of a sudden, you know, because she's being watched without her consent, you know. So
no, I'm completely with you, and obviously that whole opening scene is just a huge predecessor to one of Argento's biggest fans, that of course, Mr. Brian De Palma.
Yes,
all of his films are heavily indebted to Argento's aesthetics. In fact, I feel like while De Palma was routinely ripping off Hitchcock's mode of filmmaking when it comes to those plots and whatnot.
Sure.
Argento is probably his most spiritual successor when it comes to defining what makes a De Palma film, and obviously they're still uniquely his as well. But he'd be nowhere without having Argento coming out around the same time that he was coming around too.
It's an interesting point.
Yeah. And, you know, as you mentioned earlier with Halloween and whatever, that's another good point, which is the fact that giallo, the movement in Italy, single-handedly pretty much created over here in America the slasher movement. A lot of American directors were watching these movies at that time, and a lot of them wanted to obviously make their own. And that's kind of how the slasher craze is born, because obviously, like I said, that these movies are kind of very Euro flavored. They're always usually about a very kind of pretentious upper elite protagonist, and usually the people that are picking them off are a lot of times kind of a class divide, or for some reason, or maybe not a divide, and they're just bumping off their own class. But we took it the other way. We went straight for the immoral teenagers who don't even have a life yet, and so anyway. But the direct causality there from the Italian giallo movement to the slasher craze, and obviously Black Christmas being kind of the linking movie in Canada, between the two. So
it's an interesting point. I mean, I never really thought about it before. I mean, I thought about the giallo and the slasher films in the late 70s and 80s, but I never really thought about, you're right, the class distinctions there. I mean, you've got, when you get to Friday the 13th, it's suburban, almost blue collar in a lot of ways. A lot of these teens are not well-to-do per se. And so it is an interesting new wrinkle that the Americans brought to it.
No, yeah, they were not going to a summer camp that was for, preppy kids or anything like that. It was
right.
They were going because their parents either weren't watching them or because their parents couldn't watch them or whatever. Therefore, they were going to get up to no good, and they deserved to die.
Right. Well, you mentioned De Palma, and I'll definitely want to talk about him much later on, actually. But you're right about the fact that I think some of Argento's almost dreamlike quality to the voyeurism is so similar to what you see later in De Palma. Even though they were contemporaries, like you said, it does seem like De Palma was taking a lot of notes, like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, for me, like the whole dreamlike quality of the scene of Monica at the gallery, and it's dreamlike also in the way that Sam is, like, his ineffectualness. It's like he's stuck inside a glass container. So again, he's a voyeur, but he's also contained, and his inability to help is shown for like such a long time. It's like agonizing minutes of just watching the would-be feels like minutes, watching the would-be murder victim through the doors. And Sam's like, he's reduced to basically a spectator or voyeur against his will.
Well, but also he chooses to watch the whole time.
True. True.
Obviously, one, I guess, could make a case that like he was doing that out of like, I guess, helpfulness in case there was something. But after a certain while, there was literally nothing he could do. So it almost would have made more sense to turn around and only watch the street, so that way you could try to flag down more people. Then you get those ineffectual strangers who walk by, and even that part felt like a dream where he's knocking, and he is apparently that glass is so thick that you can't hear a peep out of it when he's on like the direct other side of it, which I felt that was also very dreamlike logic.
Very much so. And I mean, there's that shot where the camera swivels around and you see this pedestrian and his face is like right up in the glass. And it's like, he went from like nobody's there to suddenly this guy. And of course you realize immediately he's not a danger or anything. He's just like, whoa, what's going on?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and of course the fact that Sam doesn't apparently speak Italian because he's like police, and the guy's like, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, in the span of that whole scene with him in the glass, it quite literally ranges in the entire span from see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. If first he sees something he can't understand, then neither party can hear each other, and then of course he's not allowed to speak, literally get it out and articulate it. So
that's a great point. But it does go on, and I don't know if it goes on for minutes, but it feels that way to me. It's like it goes on to the point where he kind of settles into a detente with the doors, or at least some acceptance. He knows he can't open it, and the time starts crawling by, and he ends up like sitting on the floor with his hands in his pockets, waiting for the police. I mean, again, I don't know if this was an influence, but it sort of reminded me of the climax to Uncut Gems.
Yeah.
Yep. With Eric Bogosian's character, he's stuck there sweating in that locked vestibule, and he finally just sits down because he realizes there's like nothing he can do at that moment. So he's watching his money either about to go away or be tripled or whatever, but there's nothing he can do. And he basically has to, he's reached the acceptance phase of just sitting there. He's like loosening his tie. I felt like I wondered if maybe Uncut Gems was playing a bit with this scene, and even like the score like becomes more sedate and resigned. The woman on the other side of the glass just bleeding gradually becomes like this immovable fact, and the score gets sort of waltzy and chimey, and Sam starts like scanning over the room like, what's the deal with all these sculptures? It's just so bizarre, I absolutely loved it. It's such a striking scene. I could see it very easily being very iconic for a lot of filmmakers.
Yeah. You just pointed out that there's a lot of sculptures in that gallery, and I think that that's actually very intentional, because I like the idea that now there's many different kinds of art, but when in this movie, just to almost like drive the point home, I love that most of the art that's featured in that particular moment in time in the gallery is very physical. It's not just canvases, but it's these actual protruding almost objects. And as we see at the very end of the movie, they have the literal capacity to either trap people or even to hurt them. I mean, there's spikes quite literally on the entire thing that Monica pushes onto Sam. And of course, that probably gets us into our big theme of the entire movie as far as what maybe gets the most lip service, which is the idea of art and its role in media and violence contained therein. Is it something that it truly does stay within the picture, or is there something that does affect the real world, or vice versa? Dan, what are your thoughts, either just how the movie symbolizes this, or even just what you think the movie ends up saying? Do you have any first impressions?
Well, it's funny because in my notes, I remember writing down at the end, I said, see, now we know for certain that art kills, because I mean, it does. I mean, and it's not just that the huge slab of like an Iron Maiden thing that pins him to the floor, but I mean, the painting sparks the killings, that triggers it.
Yeah.
I find that very fascinating. One thing I will say, although actually just about the gallery thing before we get into the art so much, is because it's such a bravo scene. I mean, it's just like, I've watched it probably 4 or 5 times now. Yeah. And like you said, the sound design is brilliant, and the editing, and just, you really have no idea, at least I didn't have any real idea what was going to happen. I assumed she was dead, basically. And then when they're like, oh, it's just a flesh wound, you're like, oh, that's interesting. And then, of course, at the end, it's revealed why.
Yeah, I was going to say, it makes that whole scene, it takes away some of the dream logic, which I love, which is the idea that she just playing captive instead of running away.
Well, and the other thing, too, is, of course, you realize at the end that Sam's big claim to fame, which is that he got somebody to call the police for Monica. You realize, of course, no, that was really the husband. He probably called them as soon as he ran out of the room. So Sam's big heroic move was not probably him at all. I mean, not to say what he did was bad, but
I was going to say.
So, yeah. But I mean, the whole time during that, again, while he's contained, he's a voyeur, he's stuck there and he's looking, but he can't do a damn thing about it. We become more aware of Monica's groans and sighs, and they take on this orgasmic texture. And it reminded me a little of Cloris Leachman, rest in peace. There's this thing at the beginning of Kiss Me Deadly, the opening credits, where she's gasping for breath. She's like getting her breath back.
Yeah.
And it takes on this extremely sexual quality. That'd be an interesting film to actually do an episode on one day. But the funny thing about the orgasmic thing is that at first I was like, well, maybe I'm a guy and I'm being a little hetero at the moment here. But later, when you see the stalking of the fourth and fifth victims, and then later still during this scene where Sam is being chased by needles, and then of course again even during the climax, the score by Morricone even starts adding percussive women's moans and sighs. It's almost a feedback loop where it's like that band Mission to Burma. They used to have this thing where there was a fourth guy on stage who would just tape what they were currently playing, and he would spit it back out at them at different speeds with different effects, dub effects and the like. The score becomes this almost like infernal, photo negativized version of like that Serge Gainsborough Jane Birkin track,
Oh yeah.
Je t'aime,
Yeah.
Je t'aime. It's like Je t'aime becomes, je blesse, which I believe means to wound. It's one of the few words in French I know, so don't be too impressed.
I'm not.
Well, thank you. I would hope you wouldn't. You can't be duped that easily. So, but the whole orgasmic quality to Ramones in the gallery makes a lot of sense too when you realize later that we see Monica's euphoria when she kills. I realized looking back, and again, I only caught this really the second time watching it, but that scene is really her unplanned, totally unexpected chance for her to play act as one of her victims.
Yeah.
So in retrospect, of course,
and she has a voyeur.
Yes, exactly. But I mean, so it makes sense that she would be very sexually aroused by this kind of impromptu thing. I mean, we even see at the end the obsession to kill totally overtakes the craft of trying to stay alive. I mean, when she goes to kill Sam, I mean, she's totally going to be found out. She doesn't care. She's just in this extreme elation, and she doesn't even bother to protect herself anymore. I don't know, it's interesting to see again, like that. Like I know you said in giallo, there's a lot of often a psychosexual element, and in this one, of course, it's turned on its head a bit because the killer in the end, or at least some of the killing, is done by a woman. But of course, it's also triggered, like we were saying, by a painting of a violent act done to her.
Sexual act, yeah.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
And actually, speaking of about the trauma thing, I don't know if you feel this way, but I can't think of many movies that do a better job of pictorializing like the lingering psychic effects of witnessing a brutal act of violence. Like traumatic events, they have a way of burrowing into your brain, and flashes of those images will just like bob to the surface at often extremely unpleasant times, or unhelpful times at least,
Yeah.
And any chain of thoughts might suddenly land you in the midst of one of those deeply unpleasant memories while your cortisol levels go through the roof. And of course, it's traumatic memories that first activate Monica's killing spree. But also near the beginning, we see these lightning quick edits that keep appearing while Sam is trying to forget the gallery incident. He's come back to his apartment, and the edits just keep hitting him. They're like pummeling him. It reminded me very much of that kind of intrusion of memory edits in things like Sidney Lumet's The Pawnbroker, or a lot of Nicholas Roeg has that.
Oh, yeah.
Or even Upstream Color, that Shane Carruth movie has a bit of that.
Yeah.
And then, when you add to that, like after they've made love, there's like the metronome is going behind them and they're kind of laughing.
Yeah.
It's almost like the Telltale Heart, where it's like no matter how hard you're trying to forget about it and pretend it's no big deal, the memory keeps like surging back.
Yeah.
And in a way, I found that really fascinating to see that kind of trauma, not just in the case of Monica, of course, but in the case of Sam, who keeps sloughing it off like, nah, ain't no thing. He makes a big joke out of it, but it keeps coming back in his mind. And I don't think it's just the puzzle of it. I think it's also his just the fact that he's a human being and he can't deny the fact that he's been in some way traumatized by this.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think we're going to touch on trauma and art when we come back from this little break we're going to take. But sit tight and listen to this wonderful theme song.
I made dirty calls because I'm a creep.
It was only a phone call, but it was a work of art.
Torture, pleasure me. You know who you are? You're the son of a thousand fathers, all bastards like you. Call me baby. You gotta understand, I thought you were dead.
This is the end of your rotten life, you motherfucking dope pisser.
You wouldn't like it. Bunch of guys with ceremonial regalia touching each other in a ritualistic compliance.
Jeff, you're acting like a schoolboy. You know what? I feel like a schoolboy. I've never felt like this in my life.
It's kind of some fucking movie, you know? We're a fucking team. We're like Starsky and Hutch. Oh my goodness. Isn't that just wonderful? Don't take it so seriously, it's only a film.
Hello and welcome back to the Projects Pod. That's right, Project Exploitation. I don't know if that'll catch on or not. We'll see. We're talking...
We will make it so that it's streets ahead of all of their slang, my friend.
Ah, look at that. Little community reference.
Mm-hmm. Love it.
What is that? Well, if you have to ask, you're street behind.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Oh, good show.
Great show.
We're talking The Bird with the Crystal Plumage, and just before the break, which, by the way, I just had a wonderful bottle of J&B on my break. That
the whole thing?
Yep, the whole thing. But no, that is another staple of giallo films. There is a bottle of J&B in half of the shots in any giallo film. So literally you can count them. So
that's really interesting. I do remember there being a fair amount of that at Sam's apartment.
Yep. That is not unique to this movie. That is a staple of the genre. I don't know if it was I've never looked into the actual history behind it. I don't know if it's the sponsorship or whatever, but yep. And I'm talking like label always facing the camera, that kind of
right.
placement. So, it's a drinking game in and of itself.
That kind of surreptitious product placement you would only see in, say, the mid to late 80s. They just always had to have a fucking Pepsi, right there on screen. Just
Pepsi One.
Label towards the, anyway, sorry.
No. So... we're going to get into art. One thing I do want to talk about is a reaction to what you were saying just before the break about the orgasmic scene that Monica puts on for our protagonist. And, you're spot on with all that, and that I think it's definitely this weird bravura performance that is sexually arousing and whatnot. And the other thing, too, is that it becomes that I had mentioned earlier about how a lot of these films are kind of psychosexual in nature, even when a lot of them aren't featuring a lot of sex. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And I think that's obviously the case as to what you just described. But to even piggyback off of that, I would say that whole scene in and of itself is technically one big visual metaphor for impotence, because what is impotence if not forced voyeurism?
Right.
It is the act of putting on a show and quite literally not allowing the other person in the room to be a participant. So
right.
All he can do is bang on the glass and feel those feelings and none of the, shall we say, reward. Because as much as it's a scary tableau or whatever, I'm completely with you and think that it is very psychosexual, and there's a reason why he's not looking away.
Right. I mean, in some ways, it reminds me a bit of the scene near the beginning of Only God Forgives, where the Ryan Gosling character, his Thai girlfriend, or maybe Malaysian. Gosh, no, it was Thailand because it's set in Bangkok. She ties him, no pun intended, to the chair, and then she proceeds to do this
and
rather...
she bangs cock, no pun intended.
God damn it. I'm trying to run a clean operation here, you know? And every time we start scraping respectability... No, I know. You're right. Anyway, but so she ties him to the chair... because he, this is consensual, but she ties him to the chair and then she proceeds
Thank you for clearing that up.
Well, you never know.
No, I'm just saying we were all concerned about Ryan Gosling.
You felt like maybe Ryan Gosling was overpowered by this little slip of a woman, but it's possible. Yeah. But anyway, but then she proceeds to do this highly sexualized performance for him. And it's almost like he's punishing himself. Or in a sense, it's like you said, it's a metaphor for impotence in a sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. So yeah, let's talk about our collective impotence. You and me, Dan.
So much to say here.
We're going to move on and talk about trauma and art. And one thing I wanted to start with is that you had earlier said that you can't recall, at least off the top of your head, like another movie that, correct me if I'm wrong, but you had something to the effect of like another movie that portrayed trauma quite this clearly in its distillation of the triggering effects that can kind of crop up.
Yeah, right.
I guess, do you want to rephrase what you were saying, or am I onto something before I go off on something else?
Oh, no, that's basically it. It was just that you have these traumas, then you kind of try to move past them. And then as time goes on and rather unfortunate moments, they sort of bob to the surface all of a sudden because a word or a phrase or a image you see or just whatever it is, a train of thought leads you to there.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, it can be very alarming. It's like, and I think the editing in those sequences is so good at showing that he's trying to put it out of his head and it keeps kind of pummeling him again and again.
Well, then I would say I completely agree. And to add to that, then I agree. And not only that, but I also think that the ending, the reveal, so to speak, that the killer saw this painting and the painting itself was technically an actual visualization of the attack that she herself was a victim of. And this, I think, says a lot about trauma and the way humans process it. But that when she then saw it from this, technically speaking, a third-party perspective,
right,
she identified with the killer and not with the victim.
Right.
And, it's so funny. I remember the first time I saw this, that kind of blew me away. Not because of like the twist aspect, but just of the profundity of that, realization, because I feel like that is what it's like when you are a victim of trauma. Because even at the end of the day, sometimes you still have this kind of empathetic feeling, which can then feed into your own self-loathing about what you deserve and what you don't,
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
So it's like when you remove the not safety blanket, but the pretense of that it's you in one of those two roles, you ascribe yourself to the role because you think badly of yourself. Because of the trauma that it's such a vicious circle, and I absolutely love that. Besides the fact that the reveal was a good twist, it's just a really good, like I said earlier, distillation of that kind of dissociative effect that trauma can have on you and the way it can fuck you up.
No, it's true. And of course, it's a cliche because it's so true that, people who are sexually abused or physically abused or both as children grow up and do the same thing to others, especially their own children. It's like you said, it's a very vicious cycle. And unfortunately, it's not just a device for the film. This is it rings really true.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk these days about triggering, of course. It is a good word for that. When it's properly used.
I don't even like to hear the word trigger, if I'm just being honest.
You're triggered by the word trigger. So like when you're...
Yes. Only because people use the hard R, okay?
Right.
I'm okay with trigger,
mm-hmm.
but I think it's extremely offensive when people go all in on the word.
So, yeah, it should be trigger.
We're canceled before episode 10.
Okay, and yes, we've rightly been canceled for this. So, so when you watch a Roy Rogers serial and he talks about his horse Trigger, you're like, dude,
yep,
you can't do that shit anymore.
Well, here's the thing. Yeah, it was a different time back then, so.
It was a simpler, better time. No, I'm kidding. Anyway, but going back to the trauma thing, it's like, the painting that's the triggering painting, it more than suggests vaginal wounding, mutilation that you'd almost expect from what I would think of as a femicide crime. It reminds me of those historical crimes that female protagonist, the she character in Antichrist, is researching. Lars von Trier's Antichrist. It's interesting because she does the same thing. The killer, I should say, Monica does the same thing in great, very horrific detail. During the fourth murder, there's all those close-ups of Monica's open mouth, intercut with the forced removal of the fourth victim's panties. And then when you look at the earlier crime scene photos that they're looking at the police station, there's clearly a highly sexualized placing of the stockings and the panties pulled around their ankles. It's very disturbing. And yet at the same time,
very hot.
Oh, God damn you. I am cutting that for sure.
You left way too much pause. I was trying to get in.
I was trying to find the right. Yeah. So hot. No. But I felt like there's, even after we learn all this, there's a certain, like watching the film again, there's a certain inscrutability to the killer's motives that never really lifts at the end, even when it's revealed to be Monica. And I don't mean this as a negative sense. In fact, it reminded me a lot of the torturer murderer in Takashi Miike's Audition, where the trauma that seems to jumpstart her behavior, at least for the audience, remains kind of vague, unshaded in.
Yeah.
And in the case of Miike's Audition's antagonist and Monica, in both cases, the reasons are not overly explained, which maybe is okay, No,
I'm with you. And although I will say at least one reason you can probably chalk the inscrutability up to is the fact that it is revealed that the husband committed some of the crime.
Yes.
Because the thing is, there's a parallel subplot that's happening in the movie that also then dovetails and becomes part of the main plot, which is the idea that there's a serial killer out there. Like there's who and what happened in the gallery, and then there's also a Jack the Ripper-like figure, at large, and so we just assume it's the same one in the one, which is ironic because the answer becomes both yes and no, which is it was related, but the actual act of seeing them as separate incidents would have maybe clued them into that there are separate people and that, one's murderous rage or whatever kind of fueled the other person's.
Right.
So that's at least one reason that there can be a little bit, I would say that I would let a little of this befuddlement just sit there because it kind of works in the favor of the answer to this puzzle.
Well, yeah, man. That's one of the things I always wonder about is, which scenes are Alberto Rainieri covering Monica's tracks, and which scenes are Monica herself on the loose, And
yeah.
The two times we see Rainieri and Monica struggling with the knife, you realize, of course, in retrospect, he's trying to get the knife away from her.
Right. It's more of a struggle to not kill than it is.
Right. Yeah. Like in the novel, for instance, the guy who started the stand-in for the Ranieri character, he realizes about after the third murder what's happened, and he's trying to stop her, but also trying to throw the police off the track. So it's, in a way, he's partly responsible as well, although not maybe to the extent that Ranieri is in the film.
So, obviously, we've talked about it at length already, but, art is a central, I don't want to say character. It's not like New York City is like the main character in this
Yes.
movie.
I have to admit, I've grown tired of hearing people go, it's almost like the city is one of the characters. I'm like, if the city doesn't actually have a line of fucking dialogue, it's not a character. I don't give a damn what you say. No, Anyway, sorry. Go on.
No, and so but art is obviously a central vessel for a lot of themes and emotions that are very tangled up into a lot of knots in this movie. But it is so ever present throughout.
Definitely.
Obviously, the catalyst for the entire thing takes place in the art gallery itself, but then there's even the art gallery almost folding into itself as a tableau, because once he's trapped in the glass, the art gallery becomes its own art piece, almost like an installation that he's watching. And
yes,
that in and of itself it feels like a stand-in for giallo as an art form, and to whether it has, artistic value or not. And this just carries throughout the entire movie. I mean, one of the characters obviously is triggered by the painting, which also means that, trauma itself is quite literally captured via a painting. The sculpture traps the protagonist at the end. Our protagonist literally takes a detour before the climax to go see Bob Ross by way of Bluto from Animal House.
Yes!
At his little farmland. And, and has conversations with him.
Oh, I absolutely love the Berto Consalvi character. I think I mentioned this to you the other day, but it's worth repeating. There's a part where he gets up and he puts exactly one brush stroke on the canvas, and then he says to himself, genius. It made me laugh out loud by myself. It's the portrait of the artist as a self-satisfied prick who just thinks every single damn thing he does is just marvelous.
He's got to live with those cats, which look like a hassle, I mean.
He's got to fatten them up and then kill them and eat them. I mean, it's very difficult for him. Yeah. It's hard out there for an artist living in the country by himself with no doors to his house. I
was going to say, you have to climb a ladder to get up there, which is like the most artiste thing ever.
Totally.
But I mean, even that passage obviously centers around art. I mean, he's there under the false pretense of pretending to want to buy his art, So, I mean, art is everything in this movie, and obviously that's not unintentional, but it does bear, mentioning, because that's, a lot of the times, and the reason why we're doing this podcast is because we try to break down what is art, and does it still exist in these types of pictures, and and obviously we don't really ever have to have that debate, because you and I are doing this because we believe that no matter what.
True. Yeah, it's something of an article of faith for us already, I think, at this point.
Yeah, but obviously it's always going to be a question to people who are not always into these things, and that can be an uphill battle at times, because you have to try to get them to see your perspective on something that just aggressively puts them off.
Mm-hmm.
But a movie like this just knocks it out of the park in how it really depicts that these things exist. They are pieces of art, whether you want them to be or not. I mean, that's the scary part, right? Like, these are not just found articles of like, what is this? How did, this didn't just happen. A crew got together, somebody wrote the script, the director directed, and these things deserve to be dissected, because if we're not careful, maybe these can be triggering. And I think I love these types of movies, and I love what they have to say, or sometimes I hate what they have to say and kind of love that I hate it, and therefore I get off on it. I don't know, whatever.
Sure. No,
but
I get you.
I always have a reaction to them, and for me, that's what art is. It's reacting, and it's engaging, which is why I will watch any of these things over maybe a more mediocre movie any day. It's just because I want to sit there and not be passive. And It's hard to watch a movie like this and be passive. And that doesn't always strictly mean that it's simply for the cheap thrills, even though I do love those. We can talk a little bit later about some of the great kills or whatever. But
sure,
this movie is composed gorgeously. I mean, there's not a shot in this movie that's wasted. I forget which character is walking through the apartment and going up the stairs, but the shot from when they're first at the landing of the stairs, and then the light in one of the floors goes off as they're ascending the stairs. I mean, that whole sequence is such a weirdly simple sequence, in that it's actually kind of like a transition sequence, because the action is not yet really on display. And yet, if that's what the downtime in this movie looks like, I mean, the rest of the movie is also immaculate in its conception. So what about you, Dan? Is there any shots that you remember to be quite striking?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, again, Vittorio Storaro was one of the greats. I mean, he did Apocalypse Now, he did Reds, 1900. Obviously, I mentioned The Conformist, Last Tango in Paris, The Last Emperor. Just a great many absolutely extraordinary films. But I mean, there never feels like there's a moment where there isn't something being deliberately done, not just to play on our nerves and to play us like a piano, like, Alfred Hitchcock used to always say, but also to reinforce the themes that you and I have been talking about. Like you were talking about the thing with, I think it's the fifth victim. There's this triangle of staircases pictured around the fifth victim.
Yes. It's very geometric.
Very geometric. It totally accentuates this trapped helplessness, this inevitability of her death. I think that's absolutely an extraordinary shot. So, I mean, you noticed it, I noticed it, but it also ties in so well with the theme. It's not just beautiful, but it fits so perfectly with these ideas of compartmentalization or containment. And there's even like, I don't know what you think about this, but there's this thoroughly weird imagery at the beginning of that cat inside the glass cases at the Ornithology Institute.
Yeah, it's one of the most photogenic cats and just a great cat actor.
Yeah, it's really a Jellicle cat in many ways, because Jellicle cat.
Jellicle cat.
Oh, anyway. But I mean, I can't decide what's weirder, man. The mere presence of the tabby within the glass cases, or the fact that it must so obviously be super frustrated by the fact that it's amongst all these, I would assume, normally delectable birds that are actually just stuffed with sawdust because they're just fake, So I mean, it's talk about impotence. You have this cat who's a voyeur.
Yeah.
He's contained, and he's also totally ineffectual. There's no birds for him to hunt or kill or eat. I mean, he's just some tabby just sitting there going, I don't know what to do now, man. It's just such an odd image, and it's never explained.
Sylvester and Tweety, the Red Light District Diaries.
Yep, exactly. Well, I mean, I think we've all seen those underground cartoons, from.
Maybe you have.
Well,
bring in the perverts.
Oh, such a great line. Well, the other thing too is that you talked about the analogies between art and giallo, art in the film and giallo, and film as art in itself. You were talking earlier about Susie Kendall, who plays Julia. She's very unconventionally written and played. At first, she seems very oddly unconcerned for Sam's like psychic well-being, or the fact that like a knife-wielding maniac is on the loose, but. Again, I think he might have just played it off in such a way that she just thinks he's kidding. But there's other times where she's almost like comically sex preoccupied. Like she's like all but flinging herself at him on several occasions when he's in the middle of trying to research the case. But yet at the same time, there's that scene where she walks in with the groceries and he's just hung up that print of the painting, the triggering painting in question. And she's like, oh, this gives me the creeps, which I totally understand. It's a very creepy, weird painting. I don't understand why anyone would want it in their home. But so she's making out with them, but then she turns her gaze towards it again. And I think the scene cuts there. It's like she's, like us, sort of repulsed, but intrigued at the same time. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for maybe exploitation in general, but I mean, particularly giallo,
Yeah, and it's inextricably tangled up in her sexual preoccupations. Like this isn't something she just thinks about on her downtime. It's also where her mind wanders at its most ecstasy centered. So
yes,
not because you understand it, but because you don't have to understand it. It's impulsive, and that's just how it works. So.
And I mean, if we're not really being judgmental, I mean, we know all sorts of people who feel that way, and perhaps even ourselves, we have those impulses too. So, so interesting side note, something I found out, which I think you will enjoy, especially Susie Kendall, who plays Julia, is one of the Foley, quote, cameo screamers in Peter Strickland's movie Berberian Sound Studio from 2012.
Oh, yeah.
I thought that might tickle you because, isn't that cool?
That does tickle me. Consider me tickled.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I mean, it tickled me. And I was like, she did.
Just a bunch of tickle monsters.
We're like, it's like Tickle Me Elmo up in this place. No, anyway. But I mean, she hasn't done like a movie in years, but she did it for this because Berberian Sound Studio is very much both an homage and in some ways a critique of some of the excesses of giallo. And it's very funny while also being very horrifying and, well, psychosexual, psychotic. There's a lot of that. It's basically about a guy who's slowly going crazy in this case, it's like Sam. It's an English-speaking guy in Italy. He doesn't speak the language at all. He's totally surrounded by these folks he doesn't understand in a culture he doesn't get. And he's kind of slowly isolating and going crazy. So I thought it was kind of funny that Susie Kendall actually did one of the screams, the cameo screams, as they're called in the credits. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That's pretty great. She's awesome. She's she played the main character in Sergio Martino's Torso, which is another giallo film from, I think, 1974. It's one of my favorites. Probably in my top 3 giallo pictures of all time, and it's fantastic. There's a scene in Torso toward the very end, and anyone who's seen it will know what I'm talking about, in which a character is trying to hide from the killer and not make a sound, and it's probably one of my favorite instances of tension ever committed to celluloid.
Wow.
The just utter absence of sound during that sequence paired with the action that's being taken place. It's just one of the biggest nails in the sofa type, moments. So good.
Sounds fantastic. I got to watch it. Well, I think Susie Kendall, from what I remember, I knew her initially as a pretty famous British fashion model. Like, she was kind of one of the it girls for a period of years. So now, granted, she actually turned out to be a really good actor too, which isn't always the case. Sometimes models break into film and it kind of fizzles. They just, just because you're a great model doesn't make you a great actor or vice versa. But I remember her being one of those kind of late 60s swinging London models, if I remember correctly. So she did quite good. I actually thought there was a lot of I think one of the other things actually that sets this movie apart from so many movies that are about serial killers or mysteries is like the richness of the characters. And I mean, especially even the supporting characters. There's so much interesting interplay, really well calibrated dynamics between the actors, which is funny because, as you pointed out, a lot of times we're pretty sure they weren't even speaking the same language as they were performing and their stuff was dubbed later. But, like the, Faena character.
Yeah.
He's so insanely secretive. He's only in like 2 scenes, but he's hilarious because he
says like the opposite of everything he'll actually, because he'll be like, but maybe tomorrow.
I know. It's like he's always contradicting himself. He'll be like, he asks for money, and then he's like, no, I don't want any money. And then he takes it. And he's like, I don't know anything, and I don't know anybody. But he also seems to know everybody.
It's like the most cartoonish depiction of plausible deniability ever.
Right, exactly. And he's like, I couldn't find a single thing. I couldn't find anything. But here's what I found. It's absolutely hysterical. I love it.
Yeah.
I also love the sudden appearance, I think it's about 40 minutes in, of Reggie Nalder as Needles, the assassin. I think that is a masterpiece of casting because Nalder is one of those guys who you've seen in a bunch of movies, always as a villain, usually a sidekick or a Bond villain type. But he brings whenever he's in a movie, he brings decades of recognizable, bagman menace to any film he's in. There's no backstory needed. His past iconography just fills in all the gaps. He just has one of those faces with that built-in sinisterness. He's like Danny Trejo, or Lee Marvin, or Stephen McHattie, or Billy Drago, one of those guys.
Tom Hanks.
Yes, of course. Yes, Tom Hanks, who's totally unrelatable.
Just the most.
Yeah, he's a horrible man.
Grisliest, brutal character actor.
Well, he raised Colin Hanks, who, if you've seen Dexter season 6, you'll know that he's a horrible, horrible man. And there's no way that's acting. That's too good to be acting. I think Colin Hanks is really a bad man.
I don't think there was a lot of acting being done in Dexter post season 4, and even that's being generous.
Harsh but fair, unfortunately. Yeah. But Colin Hanks is a bad man. I think we can all agree that he's a truly despicable human being. That's not acting at that point.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Yeah.
The character I actually liked the most was the Garullo Solong character.
Yes.
For one thing, despite being a pimp, he seems a decent bloke, oddly enough.
That's what I was actually going to bring up, is I love the portrayal of that, because that's another way that I think Argento is very interestingly empathetic to all characters that show up, because here we have a character who, is off screen before you meet him, he's, just designated as the pimp. And then we meet him
Right.
and he's just so ineffectual when it comes to social abilities. And obviously he's got a stutter. And none of these things are pejoratives, but obviously they ground him in a way that goes against the grain in these kind of crime pictures. And I thought it was fascinating.
Totally, as you said, ineffectual, not just in his communication, but I mean, he's stuck in jail while this killer's out, and he's like, you can see how frustrated.
Like a form of voyeurism,
if you will. But he's like, if I was out there, I'd be protecting my girls. Like he seems to really believe it. It's like, also there's something about Gildo DeMarco's eyes that always makes me want to identify with him right away. I mean, he's in a lot of spaghetti westerns, and even when he's a villain, I'm kind of on his side a little. I don't know what it is. And of course, my favorite part about him is how it's pretty amusing how he observes that, like, always the craziest, most transgressively fetishistic weirdos, they're always the rich people looking for a new kind of high. He's like, it's always those guys. Those are the killers. It's like what you said about the class distinctions. That's so true in this case, where it's like, oh, this isn't some cheap hood. This is some crazy rich person, And in a way, it kind of reminded me of, essentially in the book Brave New World, Aldous Huxley kind of says the same thing, where he basically is saying at the end that the wealthy and the dissipated idle rich are so, like, what the word is, they're just so pacified that the only really intense pleasure they can get at the end is being whipped. You know what I mean? And not in a sadomasochistic way. I mean, like, actually being whipped, and they love it. They're getting this bizarre orgasmic pleasure from it at the end of the novel. And it I think in a way that's what Solong is saying. He's like, these guys, man, they get everything they want. And then, one day nothing's good enough unless it's something really, really crazy, like killing somebody or being mutilated or something like that. I thought that was actually really profound. And again, the performance by Gildo DeMarco is so good that, it totally makes me go along with it all the way.
Completely agree. So, well, I think we've run the gamut of this entire production. What do you say? Should we take it into the final stretch?
Sure. But I do have a couple quick lingering questions.
I figured. That's why I always ask.
I have a few lingering questions for you, Nick. I have some questions that need answering right now.
Probably don't have the answers, but hit me.
Okay, well, the first one is, and this one's probably stupid. How much was Carlo involved in all this? Was he just trying to whisk Monica to safety at the end, and then he ends up just being kind of collateral damage? I hate to use that word, but is that kind of what happens? Because he seems like a good guy.
Yeah, I took him as a red herring.
Okay.
Yeah, there's always got to be characters to populate out the whole thing, especially ones that maybe have a little bit of a quirk to them. So that way, it's easy not to zero in on one person until they're killed, and then there's nobody left.
Okay. That was kind of what I was thinking. Why does the murderer type up the murder plans ahead of time? I mean, it's a beautiful opening scene in the credits, but I wondered if, like, maybe there were some other scenes that were filmed and cut that might have explained the meaning of that ritual. I mean, that doesn't really matter. It's aesthetically beautiful, so I don't really care. But I just was wondering if you had a thought on it.
I do, and I think what it comes down to is that Dario Argento thought it would be a cool opening.
Okay, that's a very valid. That's a valid point.
I really have I'm with you in that it makes no sense, but I forgive it because it's the literal first scene and it's under credits. It's not even like a bumper, so it almost becomes ethereal. And maybe maybe it's a sick joke, like our protagonist has writer's block, but here the killer is able to fucking write out this banger. So.
Actually, that's an interesting point. It's almost like we are seeing a shorthand version of a script at the beginning,
Yeah.
I
mean, yeah, maybe everything we see is just the killer writing it up.
It could be. So this will be my second Nicholas Winding Refn comment of the day. Do you think that the arrangement of the many different knives in Crystal Plumage and the fact that each murder is committed with a different one was perhaps something that Refn had in mind in Drive when he depicts the Albert Brooks's character with his like creepy fetishized assortment of knives in that glass display case, I mean, because Drive has several film touchstones that are intentionally placed in there. I mean, there's like the Scorpio Rising jacket and all that. I wondered if you had thought about that, or if I'm just like, because I'm obsessed with Albert Brooks, I just, do that.
Wow. that, I don't blame you. Albert Brooks is amazing.
Same.
But Refn, I've only seen his later works, starting with Drive and through the rest of his career. I never actually went back and watched his prior stuff, even though I should. But
they're intriguing. I mean,
yeah. But at least in these movies where he really started to catch on, he never has shed his Euro influence. He's the one who started his own website that was curating grindhouse movies.
That's right. Maybe that's why I thought of that. Yeah.
I never really visited it. But I read about it, and it sounded like it was a pretty cool thing and whatnot. I don't know if it's still going or if it lasted at all. But technically, when I watch The Neon Demon, I'm reminded of Jess Franco and John Rowland and other filmmakers of that ilk. So I definitely think that Refn is always cognizant of Euro greats like Argento or Umberto Lenzi. Yeah, so I don't know if it was completely cognizant of that one-to-one, but it's definitely never out of his mind when he's making movies because it's all over the screen for sure.
Sure. It's something that, I just saw Bird with the Crystal Plumage for the first time about 2 months ago. So I've seen Drive well before, but I remember being very, not taken, but just kind of morbidly intrigued by this kind of throwaway detail of Albert Brooks's character in Drive having this weird assortment of knives. And it's a very different assortment. It's everything from daggers to a straight razor. And each one of them, after he uses it, he cleans it and he puts it back in the case. And it's so ritualized in such a disturbing way that it's always stuck with me. So maybe that was partly why. But yeah, I had forgotten about that grindhouse thing that Refn had done.
Well, and straight razors are very much a staple of giallo. Not to say that they're all committed with straight razors, but giallo favors the almost surgical-like blades over like machetes or something like that. It's always these kind of quick cuts. And actually, that whole scene in which one of the victims is quite literally hacked. I love that scene. I really love the sound mixing because in a lot of like if it's like an American slasher, like the decibel level would have been pushed up by 100, because we would want to feel the impact. But instead, in this, we hear these very unrealistic but just almost disgusting swishes. You don't really hear flesh, but you hear this swish, 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 swish. And because of that and the match cuts with the arm itself swerving back and forth across the axis of the field of vision of the shot, it just creates this very dizzying view of being murdered that is honestly more disturbing than a lot of movies that have actual blood in it, including a lot of Argento's later movies where he became a gorehound and became one of the best to do it. But, here it's very restrained. Obviously, it's still a brutal movie, but we're more interested in the voyeurism aspect than we are of actually being the voyeurs and looking at it for the cheap shock itself.
It's an interesting point. There is that kind of sickening, almost prosaic quality to those slashes. And the other thing, too, is, like you said, in an American slasher, especially from the 80s, they would have layered on the soundtrack and the score. This one doesn't have any score for that. It's very eerily quiet. So you're hearing her crying out, and then all of a sudden she stops, and you're like, oh, my God, she's dead. That's horrifying. And so it's incredibly effective. I totally agree with you. And in fact, in the Screaming Mimi, in the novel, there's a great deal of conjecture about, how many knives and what kind of knives is the killer or killers using? And to the point where everybody's talking about it. In the intro of this episode, there was an excerpt from the Screaming Mimi, and it's a conversation between a barber and the main character about, what kind of knife you think the killer's using.
Yeah.
And anyway, but I should also say thank you to Christian Wheeler, by the way, before I forget, for providing the vocal talents there for that excerpt from Screaming Mimi. Christian Wheeler is co-producer and vocal talent as well for the upcoming Diabolical Tales Radio Hour, which, just to show something else that I'm involved with, I'm mixing that particular project, and it is coming soon. So please do watch this space for more information about the Diabolical Tales Radio Hour. But yes, thank you so much to Christian Wheeler for that wonderful performance. But anyway, Okay, so another question.
Mhm.
This is more of a rhetorical question, but
Okay. I won't answer.
Well, yeah, I mean, really, there is no answer. But what's all that about the guy who's selling produce talking to his kid in that one scene where he's like, "Yeah, splat, his head burst open like a watermelon," and I'm like, "What the hell is who is it? Why is he telling his child about this? First of all, and it's just this bizarre.
Gotta learn
that people just. I guess, yeah, okay.
Gotta learn.
All right, well, that was my whole thing there. It's just really straight. I mean, it made me laugh, but I was like, later on, I'm like, wait, what? What's going on there? No, anyway. So, okay. So, and this last part is more about giallo and art in general, I guess. And it's maybe not a question so much as I guess sort of an observation or a way to amplify kind of what we've been talking about earlier. But now in the novel, The Screaming Mimi, the antique dealer, who actually is given a name, his name's Raoul Reynard, and who's actually imbued in the novel with considerably more dignity and intelligence than his opposite number in Crystal Plumage, who's kind of a homosexual stereotype kind of thing. I mean, it's not super offensive.
What?
Well, you know what I mean.
That character was gay?
I know it was a shocker, but yes. But the antique dealer, Raoul, makes an interesting observation on the novel about the inherent sadism in the artwork that sets off Monica. Now, in the novel, it's not a painting, it's a statuette. And in a way, it's kind of funny because it's almost like the reverse of the Maltese Falcon, where instead of like this statuette that's super precious, it's like a statuette that's been like mass produced everywhere. And it's you just sell it at an antique store for like cheap dollars, basically. But he says, he sort of muses, I guess, that only a sadist would want to own that piece of art for their home. And in a way, he gives words that I think maybe help explain my fascination / general aversion to most slasher movies like we've been talking about. There's a disturbing delight that some filmmakers seem to take in depicting the stalking and killing of women. And it does feel somewhat sadistic. And I know you and I have talked about this, not just in this episode, but just even in other conversations, which I guess it leads me to a more wide sweeping question, which you and I have talked about, which is it basically required for a giallo film to be at least in part about hurting beautiful women, or is that an aesthetic consideration instead of a misogynistic one? And before I hand it over to you about that, I just want to say one thing I thought was interesting was that obviously in this case and in the novel, the inclusion of a woman being a serial killer is definitely a new wrinkle. And in the extras for Bird with the Crystal Plumage, I don't know if you saw this one, but a academic, Kat Ellinger, she mentions that there may have been an uptick in women serial killer characters after the Tate LaBianca murders in 1969, the Manson family stuff, particularly women wielding knives. And so I wondered, I don't know if I actually have a question exactly, or if it's, I feel like this is something you've probably thought a lot about, and I just wondered what you thought.
Yeah, I think it's always going to come down on both sides, which is that I definitely think it's an aesthetic choice. I mean, these are mostly heterosexual male directors making movies about what both frightens them but also excites them. And, the cross-section between those two things are usually beauty and violence. And the only way to get them both in the same shot is to enact violence against beauty. And so I definitely think that that's inherent in a misogynistic society, a patriarchal society at large. I mean, that's kind of obviously the slasher craze too, as there's a lot. Although the slasher craze obviously had the whole final girl thing emerge from it, which is its own interesting repudiation.
Definitely.
Which is both something that's gotten out of hand, not in the sense because it doesn't exist, but because people put a little too much faith in that being a conscious choice, at least at the beginning of when it happened. But that's a whole other thing for another time.
Oh, sure. No, yeah, absolutely.
In this case, and with giallo in general, I think it definitely is both. It's inherent in a patriarchal society, but also Argento himself. In fact, Argento, with this one at least, is actually pretty tame compared to a lot of his peers. I mean, he would up the violence for sure. There are shots in like opera where people's eyelids are being taped open with needles, and things like that, and it's fantastic.
I have to admit, I've been kind of hesitant to watch that one because I know about that, and I'm like, ooh, boy, I don't know if I can do that one yet. Maybe I'll have to watch it eventually.
Yeah, but other people like Bertolenzi and Sergio Martino were not shy about mixing in the sex parallel. Not just sex appeal, but having this actual psychosexual frustration front and center and informing the motives for a lot of the killings. The idea of impotence being actually part of the text instead of the subtext. So, I don't think there's really a great answer, obviously, but it's definitely something that I think pervades the entire genre, for better and for worse. Sometimes you get some great art dealing with the fragile masculinity, and sometimes you just get art made by fragile men. So,
well, and I say this knowing full well that perhaps Argento's most celebrated, well-regarded film is Suspiria, which is all women.
It is, and it's not really a giallo.
It's not.
Everybody calls it that because they think Italian horror and made by Dario, but
right.
It's about witches, not really the same thing at all.
True, but I mean that character at the end, she's not only the final girl, but I mean there's that very enigmatic smile on her face in the rain at the end. I don't know if our listeners have seen the film, but well, anyway, it's worth watching. But I mean, it's very much a woman. She's an outsider. She comes in, and at the end, she's triumphant. And she does have this sort of odd smile, like, "Oh my God, I'm still alive. This is great." Which I love. I mean, that seems about as far from misogyny as one can get.
Oh, yeah. I completely agree. And I really think someone like Argento, you can't not make a movie without misogyny if you're a male and you live in this world, because it's ingrained in you. Mm-hmm. However, there are people who I think love sleaze but don't hate people. And I think Argento is one of them. And I think, even something at its worst, like in this movie, the flamboyant antique dealer, is really not as egregious as some other movies of its same era.
Definitely.
I think the performance is obviously deliberately, stupid, whatever, but it never also feels like the movie itself is actually laughing at the character, which is
right.
A whole other layer that can add to the frustration of seeing this kind of representation throughout the years. So while I do think it's not great, it's also still, bring in the perverts, right? I mean, that's Argento's MO. Like from this movie on, he would start to populate his characters with slightly more grounded homosexual and lesbian characters. So even if it's pretty flamboyant this time around, I think the idea there was mostly just that he needed a side character, and the side character happened to be gay. So therefore, the one detail we even get to learn about him has to be heightened, and it's not right, but at least it's understandable, so to speak.
Well, and I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing his portrayal of the character. It's actually not that bad. I mean, it's somewhat humorous.
No, but it's certainly worth commenting on.
Well, and I think because I read the novel and because the character is so three-dimensional in his one scene in the novel, very much the main character, Sweeney, goes into his antique shop and he's kind of watching the guy. He's like, well, he's clearly a fag, or whatever he says, something very, it's his internal monologue is very unflattering.
Right.
But within a few seconds, he's like, oh, I really admire this guy. I can see the way he really keeps a tight ship. And as they talk, the rapport continues, and they're obviously both extremely intelligent men. So in a way, I guess, maybe the antique dealer in Bird with Crystal Plumage suffers by comparison, but it's really not that bad, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't think.
Right on. Well, why don't we head into final ratings? I will go first. I think this movie is a masterpiece, like I said earlier. I think it's probably my favorite giallo of all time. I don't know. It's hard to choose sometimes between some movies, like I mentioned earlier, like Torso by Sergio Martino, or even something like, actually another movie by him, Sergio Martino, The Strange Vice of Mrs. Ward.
Ah, yes. You've talked about that.
Which is a very feminist giallo, where we're following a female character who's both a victim of a lot of shit, but also carving out her own agency the entire way. It's a very psychosexual movie. It's great. But The Bird with the Crystal Plumage is, I think, tops. It's got everything you'd ever want from a giallo, as far as, it's got some great little kills, but also the cast is just uniformly excellent, which is not always the case in these movies. Usually they get a great lead, but everybody else is kind of just, casting couched into the movie, and it's just whatever. And I don't mean that in a modern context.
No. I get you. More like out of central casting, if you will.
Yeah, but I think it's fantastic. I think rewatching it, I'm still floored by how I don't think this about a lot of movies, but I think about some, and this is one of the very few, but how every shot truly is masterfully composed. It doesn't matter what kind of transitionary action is happening, whether it's the main action or, as we were talking about, some kind of a bumper in between scenes. Everything is just composed beautifully, which really obviously highlights the themes of this movie as being almost like an installation in and of itself. And I think that's kind of Argento's MO when it comes to making these movies. As I kind of outlined earlier, when he went out to make this, he didn't want to make it at first. He was just kind of like, oh, well, no one else is going to do it. I guess I'll do it. And I think that's the pleasure of watching Argento's movies, is that these are thought out of as these installation pieces that are just thrilling to watch and rub up against as they play out. So I think Bird with the Crystal Plumage is amazing. I would give it 5 stars out of 5. I really can't fault it for just about anything. So Dan, what say you?
Well, I love what you just said about the, and you had said it earlier too. I love what you said about the idea of the film as an installation in itself, because, like we were saying, you see that in the gallery where it's very much like a tableau or a installation piece, and then of course you've got these sort of weird, almost faux curio cabinets in the Ornithological Institute. But you see that over and over again, and I do love that kind of imagery. It's almost like I don't know, Joseph Cornell or somebody who was this artist who would create these small sort of box assemblages, often with taxidermied birds or that kind of thing. So I love this idea that it's like an art installation or a tableau, and not just within the film, but the film itself is too. I very much liked the film a lot. I mean, I think I've seen it 3 times now, and I do really love the respect that Argento does give to the characters too. I mean, there's a lot of richness. I mean, even the kooky artist is an intriguing character. I mean, he could have just been a cardboard cutout, but he's not.
I love the way he talks about his early works.
Oh yeah, this is early consolable.
Whatever. It's very rare.
I know. I love that. He's a legend in his own mind, man. I love it. But if you can crack yourself up, it's like Kyle Kinane says. If you can crack yourself up in the shower, if you're laughing about some joke, you're doing pretty good. If you maybe you don't make anybody else happy, you don't make anybody else laugh, but you make yourself laugh, you're doing okay. So maybe that's what Berto Consalvi has figured out that we have. But yeah, and I also loved, like, for instance, I keep joking about the part where he's like, bring in the perverts. But it's funny because during the lineup, there's a character who's brought in who's a cross-dresser. And Inspector Morosini is like, no. Wait, what are you doing? He's not a sexual pervert. He's a cross-dresser. He's not a sexual pervert. And the cross-dresser goes, yes, well, I should hope so. Like, hey, man, I am not in the same league as these crazies, which he isn't. I mean, it's a totally different thing. But I loved that even in 1970, there was this kind of distinction. It wasn't like everybody who is involved in what they might call some sort of sex trade or sex crime is all lumped in together, So a prostitute is the same as a transvestite, is the same as a guy who exposes himself, is the same as a guy who rapes children or whatever. You know what I mean? I loved that. I really appreciated that kind of not just richness of character, but I guess to an extent respect of character. I guess that's something I keep saying when we talk about these movies. The ones I really like tend to show the filmmakers striving to make characters that are indelible and, if not 3-dimensional, because there may not be time to make them 3-dimensional, at least give them a little dignity and a certain amount of dimensionality. So I would say this movie, I currently would give it 4.5, although I would not be surprised if I would go up to 5 later. I think it's just because maybe I've only seen it fairly recently. Now I have seen it 3 times now. So, but I would say 4.5 for now.
All right. Right on, Dan. Seems like we both obviously very much enjoyed it. So that is The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. It's available now on Blu-ray and or DVD, put out in a wonderful edition by Arrow Video. On that note, Arrow Video is releasing it on 4K ultra high definition disc. In case any of you out there have a 4K player, I have already pre-ordered mine, and I am very excited to rewatch it, even though I just obviously rewatched it. So.
Awesome.
Going to be a good time this summer. In fact, they announced that like a month ago, and then just today they announced a 4K in July coming out of The Cat o' Nine Tails. Another movie by Argento. So clearly they're going to start re-releasing all of their Argento films, except for Suspiria, which was already released on 4K by Synapse Films, in a great package that everybody should pick up.
Yes, I've been meaning to for a time now. Yeah.
Oh, it's so good. I mean, like their restoration. So yeah, on to the A-list.
Are fictitious.
Wow, what a theme song. It just never gets old every time I hear it.
Teresa Brooks, my sister-in-law, I love you forever. If you had done nothing else but just made that theme, you have left a mark that I love, and obviously I'm not the only fan.
I agree. And I can't say I love you because I've never met you, and I feel like that'd be a little forward. But you seem like a good person, Teresa.
She's very lovable.
Oh,
it's true.
So let's do the A-list. And of course, the A-list is the segment in which we talk about an A movie that pairs well with this B picture that we just talked about. Of course, we're using the term B picture loosely, so do not write us angry fan mail. All right, Dan, Jeremy Brooks, why don't you hit us with your pick?
Well, see, my pick, that all depends on what you pick, so I kind of need you to go first.
Why do you need me to go first? I'm not saying I won't go first, but how does it depend on my pick?
Well, because I don't want to be redundant, so I just want to make sure I'm not picking the same thing as you.
All right, well, my pick is very uninspired, so it may very well be one of your ideas. Not because you would come up with an uninspired idea, I just mean that...
No offense taken.
But yeah, the thing that came to mind the most was due to the obviously prolific nature of this particular film, in which I will name soon, and also with it being a predecessor to this certain kind of crime thriller that emerged. And obviously this filmmaker in general was a big influence on Argento, but that, of course, is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So, yes, obviously the plots are extremely different and whatnot, but they come from a similar era right before, considering giallo hadn't quite taken off yet, and it's about to. It still has this almost like bloodless slasher feel to it, and psychosexual dynamics being subtext instead of text. And also, of course, the reveal at the end is very gender bait, because there's really never any reason why we believe that the killer has to be a male. We're just kind of led on that path because the characters believe it to be for no real reason. And the whole ending reeks of Psycho, not just because it's a similar twist, but then even the final scene is a very kind of a good, jokey remake of the final scene of Psycho, because the final scene of Psycho is the dumbest scene ever in a masterpiece of a movie. But even Hitchcock couldn't, really make that scene land as a doctor explains everything that's happening. But here, at the very least, we have a similar thing in which a lot of exposition is drawn out as we are, told why Monica felt, like she was triggered, why she went and killed everybody and whatever. But as you had mentioned earlier, with kind of under the guise of this kind of jokey talk show format, where it almost is a precursor to the whole true crime trend that a lot of people are very
True.
into, and the whole dissecting what really happened. And almost there's almost a pretentiousness to voyeurism itself. You know, if
Sure.
you're going to sit in an armchair, diagnose another person and their proclivities and their penchant for violence, that says as much about you as it does about them. So it's while the cadence is similar to the Psycho's last scene, it's a much better version of it for my money. So for some good knife wielding action and some males who feel slightly inadequate in a world in which women can kill them or smother them, I say you can't do better than a nice little pairing between Psycho from Alfred Hitchcock and The Bird with the Crystal Plumage by Dario Argento.
Well, no, that's a great choice. You're absolutely right, though. I mean, maybe, yeah, of course, it's one of those obvious choices, but you're so right. I mean, the ending of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage reminded me so much of the psychiatrist explaining at the end of Psycho, except it was a little less clunky, well, quite a bit less clunky, because, like you said, it was in the format of this show, and you even have, like I said, you have Inspector Morosini going, oh, yeah, I'm really tired. Just
yeah, it's almost like he's like, who is this scene for? Because it's not for me. I don't know why I'm here.
Well, and in a sense, it's like, man, I already did my job. Leave me alone and let the psychiatrist. I don't need to figure out why they do. You know, there's a scene in the movie Homicide where Joe Mantegna's character is like, hey, man, thank God it ain't our job to figure out why they do it. He's like, you know, we just got to catch them, but we don't have to figure them out. Thank God for that, you know? And that's kind of where Inspector Morosini is, where he's like, I think the eminent Dr. blah, blah, blah would do a better job explaining. Yeah. Also, he's dog tired. He's just exhausted. So he's like, man, I'm just here and I just need to go home. I did my job. Leave me alone. You know, so there's something really kind of beautiful about that. Well, okay, so for my A-list movie, I was thinking of choosing Felicia's Journey for this one, partly as a way to fly the flag for my main man, Adam McGoyan, who I love his filmography, as you know, and I've infected you with my love for him as well. And
you did. I watched every single film of his this past year.
Yeah, you've actually seen a couple I have not seen, I believe, so I have to get to him.
Well, every time you do something, I just want to be better than you.
Right. So. It's like the song. It's like everything you can do, I can do better. It's everything Dan can do, Nick can do better. That's what the song was originally. The lyrics.
I don't think that's a song. I think it's just a fact.
Well, in some ways, it's both. You know what I mean? It's.
Oh, that's true. That's true. If you can sing it, why not?
It's a truism. So partly it was the Adam Goyen thing, but also partly because I just wanted to lavish some praise on the late Bob Hoskins, who I keep forgetting had died a few years ago, and I feel whose skills are like quite often overlooked these days. I mean, like I think when people
Super Mario Brothers, oh my God.
Honestly, he even pulled that off. Like that couldn't have been an easy role, but he delivers, you know?
No, he does. I genuinely love him in that movie.
I know.
As I love Dennis Hopper in that movie.
True. Although I think Hoskins, comes away with more of his dignity, but that's just me, you know. But anyway, you know, but
I don't think Dennis had a lot of it to begin with.
I think you're probably right. So, but I mean, when Bob Hoskins is usually remembered, it's usually like either as Eddie Valiant, you know, great performance, Robert the Rabbit, love that movie, or is that like, you know, like funny little bald man who did some good supporting roles. But it's like he is so exceptionally powerful in some movies, like The Long Good Friday, Mona Lisa. He is super good as J. Edgar Hoover in just a small role in Nixon. I mean, the menace and evil he conveys in just like basically 3 minutes at the most is incredible. And there's a scene in Felicia's Journey where the camera is just steady on him, on his face for like 35 seconds or maybe a little longer, where he basically, without saying anything about the plot because it would take too long to explain, but he sees something that he does not want the person sitting next to him to see. He's in a bar or a pub, and his face just rolls through a large range of emotions. You've got like, you know, fear, rage, panic, and then like that kind of think, Hilditch, think, you got to get out of this, you know, because his character's Hilditch, you know, he's like, what am I going to do? It's just exquisite. And I also think Felicia's Journey shares some of The Bird with the Crystal Plumage's stylistic and, dare I say it, operatic flourishes, which play off the other scenes, which are filmed mostly naturalistically in Felicia's Journey. So it's an interesting contrast. But I'm not going to recommend that one. I am not going to choose Felicia's Journey. I am going
again,
Mm-hmm.
Breaking the rules.
Breaking the law, my friend. Me and Juice Priest. Rob Halford. No, I'm not going to choose that one. I'm going to go with Brian De Palma's Body Double from 1984. You see what I did there, right? I had my cake and I ate it too. I did it. There's no going back.
When you throw up tonight, don't come crying to me.
Fine. Okay, I probably deserve that. But so, Body Double's got a ton of overlapping themes about voyeurism and compartmentalization in there, like with Rear Window and Dial M for Murder, homages aplenty. And it's funny because I watched Body Double again recently, and I was looking at some interviews De Palma did back in '84, right when the movie came out. And this is something he said in People magazine: "Women in peril work better in the suspense genre. I don't think morality applies to art." So while I think there's a lot of people who disagree, everybody from, say, Akira Kurosawa to, John Cheever would disagree with him about morality in art. But I do understand what he's saying in a way that he's not trying to present a moral vision. He's just trying to present, like you were saying earlier, you want to watch a film that's going to provoke you, something provocative. And that's just something De Palma does in spades in every one of his movies, and especially, I think, in Body Double. I saw this other quote from him from 2016. He says, "I was always trying to find new and interesting ways to kill people." And that's De Palma in a nutshell. So basically the story is this guy, Jake, who's played by Craig Wasson, is house sitting at his new friend Sam's friend's house. So if you can follow that. So not his friend's house, but his new friend's house. And he witnesses through the telescope what appears to be sort of a botched robbery turned murder that occurs in the window of the house across the way. And actually, I should mention this side note. The house sitting scenes were filmed at the marvelous and, dare I say it, breathtaking Chemisphere House in Hollywood Hills. It's right off of Mulholland Drive. It's still there now. It's a piece of California legendary, if you will.
Yeah.
And it was designed by this guy, John Lautner, in 1960. And it's like part Googie architecture and part like Buckminster Fuller dome thing. It's just incredible. And I also learned, and this is just adds a little macabre additional aspect, I just learned this, but I guess the second owner of the Chemisphere House was actually stabbed to death in a botched robbery in 1976. So take from that what you may.
Oh.
But I'm just going to say that's really weird. But I'm digressing. The plot basically hinges on this character named Gloria at the window of this other house being like seemingly killed. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because David Robert Mitchell's flick, Under the Silver Lake, from just like 2 years ago, has an absolutely brilliant scene which riffs on Body Double. And I'm not giving anything away from the plot of that film by mentioning this. The scene is Andrew Garfield and Topher Grace, and they're using this remote control drone to spy on who they think is an underwear model living in this pretty swanky LA pad. But at the very moment when or really anyone who's ever seen a few Brian De Palma films would assume, the moment when they're expecting her to shed the last of her clothing, she just begins sobbing in this just heartrending way over this unknown anguish. And it is such a masterful scene. And it's just another great example of what I love about films and the fact that they're all part of a continuum of cinema in which the filmmakers, however separated by time, are in conversation with each other. De Palma is in conversation with Hitchcock, and, David Robert Mitchell's in conversation with De Palma. And it's just fascinating. I absolutely love that about Body Double and actually Under the Silver Lake, which is a different kind of movie. But I did consider De Palma's Sisters, because that one has got a ton of voyeurism equals death stuff too. But Body Double has got just like all that just resplendent, new wavy aesthetic colors, and it just seemed a more obvious pairing with Argento with the colors and everything. Plus there's cameos in the film from some Scream Queens, actually, I realized this time around. Brinky Stevens and Barbara Crampton, who we talked about a little bit in the Space Truckers episode too.
That's right.
So I love it. And it even has like this bloodthirsty guard dog, which actually is sort of a big part of the Screamy Mimi novel. So enough about that.
Oh, there's a huge guard dog scene in the movie Tenebrae by Dario Argento.
Oh, really?
There's like a cross like city chase. I mean, the guard dog gets out of the place that the protagonist wants to get into, but so it becomes this whole other scene of a very vicious dog bite attack scene. It's pretty great.
Well, that's actually like the dog in the Screaming Mimi novel is like really crucial. He's named Devil, and he's like fiercely protective of this character. It's okay. Another weird, strange serial killer tie-in related to Body Double is that Patrick Bateman, I found out in the novel American Psycho, he cites it as his favorite movie, which he's watched like dozens of times. So it's like I keep thinking, like I have to go return some videotapes. He must be returning Body Double, Yeah. So the other thing I'll say about Body Double that I really like is that the lead is played by Craig Wasson, who I really don't know from a lot of stuff, but he was in, and this will interest you, his main credit other than Body Double that really jumped out at me was he plays Dr. Gordon in A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, which...
Oh, yeah.
Nicholas, you have been threatening to do an episode of Projectsploitation upon, which I find a very exciting prospect. So that just ties that together, too. I have not actually seen it, but I have heard good things from you and actually from others. So it would be the Nightmare on Elm Street sequel I would go to first if I was going to. So hopefully, dear listeners, we will do an episode on that pretty soon. But one last weird thing, which is just so interesting. Craig Wasson, the guy who plays Jake in Body Double, he was in an episode of Tales from the Dark Side. And that particular episode was based on, wait for it, a Fredric Brown short story.
Shut
Boom.
up.
Yes. Everything gets a return, my friend, and it all comes back around. Fredric Brown, author of The Screaming Mimi, Tales from the Dark Side, Body Double. It's all there.
I lost faith in you a little bit during that entire segment, but then at the very end, I'm a believer again. And I saw your face.
You saw,
oh boy.
You saw that I was faithful. It took a while, but I remained faithful. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a great choice, Dan. I've actually never seen Body. I still have to watch it. I know it literally sounds like something I would absolutely love, and yet I still have not sat down to watch it, despite the fact that I've watched a lot of Brian De Palma. In fact, the other choice I was going to maybe do besides Psycho was actually Dressed to Kill, because there's a lot of stuff happening in that movie, especially at the end, that ties in and whatnot. So. Right,
there's the whole gallery sequence and the voyeurism. And that was the film I believe he did right before Body Double. And Body Double strikes me as being, all of De Palma's movies are pretty funny, but I think Body Double is a little funnier than most of his non-comedies, so not counting his early films. Like this one has a lot of very clever, sort of almost fourth wall breaking little jokes, and it's very, very amusing.
Well, and Dressed to Kill was in a lot of ways like a trial run for Body Double because the opening scene had the Body Double.
Yes. I think he said that he got the idea for Body Double by spending time with the person who was the Body Double and just kind of learning, well, what's it like to be an actor whose main job is being, and just kind of, and he thought, well, wouldn't that be an interesting idea for a plot? And you stir in some Rear Window in there and you got yourself a crackerjack film right there.
Sure do. All right. Well, I think that is going to wrap up this particular episode of the Projects Pod. That is, of course, Projectsploitation. We'll see if that's still the same next episode. I don't know. Maybe we'll just trash it all and we'll start a whole new podcast. I don't know. But
or maybe we'll just be so far streets ahead that we'll just, we'll be doing Projects Pod. We'll be doing acronyms that you haven't even heard of yet. It'll be amazing.
So, look for this space for our next episode, which is going to remain a secret, not because we don't know what we're going to do, but because it is a fun little surprise. All I can say is that things are going to heat up considerably the next time you see us. So don't be alarmed if your feed looks a little different next time around. So from myself, Nick Cheney, and from my good friend and co-host Dan Jeremy Brooks, and just keep on projecting.
In just
This needs an end, Max. I don't have an end.